My goal in this video is to share with you all the pros and cons of putting a mountain bike tire on a gravel race bike. And heads up, spoiler alert, I'm going to say it right from the start. You'll be faster with a mountain bike tire. And in this video, I'm going to show you why, all the tests I've done, and even the physical arguments behind this option, even though it might seem contradictory to use a much bigger tire. Now you have to keep in mind that there are certain technical requirements on the bike that will require some capabilities or even modifications to your setup in order to mount these tires. And of course there will also be areas where the wider tire will actually make you perform worse, where your performance will drop. But overall it's a better option than the gravel tire itself. Let's move forward with everything, but before that I'm going to ask you to please hit the subscribe button down below if you haven't done it yet to help me grow the project. So come on, let's go. Before we start, I want to give a bit of explanation to provide some context, and I'll also throw in a few disclaimers, very important. The first thing to keep in mind is that we're talking about mountain bike tires versus gravel tires. This isn't the typical debate within the gravel range of narrow tire versus wide tire, but rather the difference is literally between using the gravel range from tire brands or the mountain bike range. It's completely different to use a 50mm wide mountain bike tire compared to a 50mm wide gravel tire. There are technical arguments, even physical ones that I'll explain to you later, but let's just say that today we're going to talk about that differentiation. On the other hand, we're talking at all times about competitive gravel. All the other types of gravel like bikepacking, exploration, all of that I'm not getting into for now. The testing I've done, almost 1,000 kilometers, about 900 and something I've always done with this bike, with the BMC Caius, with the setup you see, and it concluded at Tracker 2026. So I've had a wide variety of terrains, weather conditions, even the surface has sometimes been damp, sometimes wet, mud, roots, I don't know, all kinds of things. So it's been a pretty extensive test. On the other hand, this testing came about organically for me since I had the chance to, above all, test a frame that allows me to use that kind of tire width, okay? It's not something I had planned. I was just curious because I've spent 2 years watching videos of Americans who keep praising putting mountain bike tires on gravel bikes, saying how much faster they are with that kind of rubber, so I had to try it myself. So let's say I've been completely independent when it comes to doing this testing. You might say, well, you have a collaboration with Michelin and all that. Look, I have 40,000 gravel tires that you've seen me use from Michelin and also from other brands. In the past, in countless races since 2018 when I've been riding gravel. But in this specific case, it was me who, of my own will, wanted to try switching to mountain bike tires. So everything you're going to see, wheels, tires, bike, the whole setup was 100% my own choice. And in fact, there were some pieces of equipment that were ruled out in advance, and let's say out of respect for the brands, I won't show them in the video. Like I told you before, I've been riding gravel since 2018. I started with rims that had a 20mm internal width and 35mm tires. I think that was the setup I used for my first gravel race or my first bikepacking adventure, I don't remember. But anyway, I've tried all kinds of tires, 38mm, 40, 42, 45. And lately I think the standard was set, and I also stuck with 25mm of internal rim width and a 45mm gravel tire. With that setup I've done countless races, Santa Valley, I've done Rancho, I've done a lot of races, even Tracker in recent years. It's true that lately, for example, in the last Santa Valley, I switched to a 47mm tire, and in La Garba I even ended up using a Michelin slick, an almost slick gravel Michelin tire of almost 50mm, which is what I got with these high level rims and their 32mm internal width. But let's say the final leap has been this Tracker with a 2.25 mountain bike tire. Let's start with the technical requirements, and the first one is very obvious, very evident, and if you don't have a frame that gives you at least 50mm of maximum tire clearance, you won't be able to use mountain bike tires, because I think the minimum recommended mountain bike tire would be a 2.00, and that's going to give you about 50 millimeters of width. You have to keep in mind that bike brands are required to leave an extra 6 millimeters in total because of the ISO regulations. So if a brand tells you it has 50 millimeters of tire clearance, you could actually fit up to 56. But you risk that if anything happens, the brand's warranty won't cover you because you used the equipment beyond what the brand officially told you, okay? To put it in numbers so you understand, with the bike I tested, this BMC Cayuse has an official maximum tire clearance of 52 millimeters, both front and rear, but by adding those extra 6 millimeters, especially in the rear because the fork has much more tire clearance. So by adding those extra 6 millimeters, I've managed to fit these 2.25 Michelin tires with a 32 millimeter internal rim width. They're a very tight fit in the rear, but they do fit. And of course, this is where we find the first downside. Later, we'll analyze the pros and cons, but right from the start, we can see that on a muddy day with a lot of mud, I wouldn't recommend using this setup on this bike because it's very likely that the tire clearance will get blocked by mud, branches, or whatever else, and then the bike just can't move forward. So for now, on this bike with such a massive width, I could have also put on a slightly narrower tire, maybe a 2.1 or something like that. But at least the way I have it now, in mud or rain, I wouldn't be able to ride it. A lot of people think that the change in the bike's behavior and the tire width is determined solely and exclusively by the tire itself. I know there's a strong interplay between the wheel, basically the rim, and the tire. To properly fit a tire as wide as those on a mountain bike, we need a very solid base, a really wide internal rim width. About a year ago, Zip launched the Explore 303. I've tried both models and I have to say, they're not really to my liking. That new standard they proposed of 32 mm internal rim width does seem like a great idea to me, but there are several things about those wheels that don't add up for me. For example, the fact that their compatibility is limited to very few tire models. Or for example, the fact that they have a 54mm rim depth, which looks really good on the bike aesthetically, but it ends up going against the absorption capabilities of the wheel itself, because you know that for a wheel to absorb impacts well, impacts that it encounters, what you need is to have the longest possible spoke. The higher the rim profile, the shorter the spoke, and the less the wheel absorbs, so it doesn't make much sense. On the other hand, running that much rim depth for aerodynamic reasons. If you put on a tire with a lot of volume, it not only gets wider, but it also gets taller. Therefore, the combination to take advantage of the crosswind with the rim and tire, as you can see, the rim doesn't need to have such a high profile, right? So what happens here? Well, basically, at the beginning of the year, the national brand High Level got in touch with me. They said, "Hey, Daniel Race, we're going to launch a new gravel wheel with a 32mm internal width." There isn't much to choose from on the market right now in this new standard width. And well, I told them, okay, let's try the wheel. I tried it and said, this has to be my wheel for tracker. Why? Well, because like I said, it has a 32mm internal width. That's the key nowadays. It has a 40mm rim depth, which, as I said, for me is more than enough, because you have to find the right combination between the tire and the rim. It's built with SAPIM spokes. It can come assembled with the brand's own high-level hubs, or with a DT Swiss 350. I ordered them with DT Swiss 350, so I've done all the testing with them, and they weigh 1,404 grams per set. So in terms of weight, it's good. It doesn't go overboard. For me, these wheels have been the perfect balance between strength, aerodynamics, and a weight that I consider okay. So that's it. Just to tell you, if you're thinking about putting on a mountain bike tire, especially keep in mind not to put it on a rim that's 25mm, internal width 22.5mm or 20mm, because it's going to look like a mushroom. And really, the bike won't perform the way it could. no matter how much you've changed the tire, okay? If you're interested in these high level ones, I'll leave a QR code here. I don't know if I have a discount code. I think I do. Well, I'll leave everything here and in the description in case you're interested. And that's it. We already have the frame and we already have wheels. So now let's move on to the tires. It's extremely important to choose the right type of mountain bike tire because we could really mess things up here. Let me explain. Always select mountain bike tires that roll well from the available options. What happens? Most fast rolling mountain bike tires from the vast majority of brands usually have a very low, closely spaced central tread. Perfect. But a very tall and very slanted side knob, just like what happens for example with this model you see here. I've used it for a long time on my cross-country bikes. You have to understand that we are taking the tire completely out of its comfort zone. That tire was made for one use, but now we're asking it to do something else on our gravel bike, okay? And those high side knobs, what they're going to do is that when the wheel touches down, because of the pressure from the weight, the tire becomes a bit squared off. It's going to slow us down, okay? So I recommend that even if you lose a bit of grip, especially when you lean the bike into corners, it's worth looking for cross-country mountain bike tires that also have low side knobs. And in that case, that's where I was able to choose the Michelin ones. Look, here they are, the Michelin Jet XC2. It's a model I've already used before. I've competed with it in cross-country in 2.35, but in its 2.25 version, I see that the knobs are low, not only in the center, but also on the sides, and that's going to let me ride super fast with little drag. And this is the type of tire I recommend you look for to put on your gravel bike. Sizes 2, 2.10, 2.20, 2.25. I actually wanted to go to the extreme. I wanted to start by trying mountain bike tires over 55 millimeters wide, you know? So just so you understand. This rim with 32 millimeters of internal width and this 2.25 mountain bike tire is giving me about 50 to 58 millimeters of actual width. So I wanted to take the test into the extreme. The million-dollar question, why is a mountain bike tire faster than a gravel tire? There are different reasons. I'm going to highlight the most relevant ones. And let's start with air volume. A 2.25 mountain bike tire holds about 50 to 60% more air than a 45 millimeter tire at the same pressure. Okay, what does this mean? With a mountain bike tire, we're going to be able to have lower pressure, and in that sense, we'll be able to absorb bumps better. Just so you get an idea, in Santa Bay I raced with a rim with an internal width of 25 millimeters and a gravel tire that was 47 millimeters wide. And I was running a pressure of 25 psi both in the front and the back. However, with this setup I have to run about 22 psi for it to work well in optimal conditions, okay? I've switched to 2 psi increments to measure pressures more accurately, and with this kind of setup I can assure you that 24 or 25 psi is too hard, and on the other hand 20 or 21 is too soft. It feels like the tire might come off the rim. There's a huge difference from 1 psi to another. 22 is perfect for me, 23 is a little hard, but you can still ride with it. So, well, there you can see the big difference in terms of air volume and the pressures we can run inside the tires. Then on the other hand, there's the construction of the tire itself. And this is very important to understand well because the brands in a way are all still doing a lot of development on gravel tires since it's relatively new. So the tire brands, even though it might seem counterintuitive, instead of taking an off-road tire like a mountain bike tire and making a narrower version, what they did at first was take the way a road tire is built and make it wider. And with this, gravel tires have inherited the stiffness and the construction method, therefore the stiffness of road tires. And that's where they lose out when it comes to pure speed over continuous rough surfaces. Because you know, when you're riding on a typical trail with a lot of ripples, or with many small stones that keep causing little impacts against your wheel. Well, what happens there is that we need the tire to be able to deform a lot from the tire so that those impacts are absorbed by the tire. We don't have suspensions like in mountain bikes, so everything is transmitted to our body and goes against the bike's momentum at high speed. If we have a tire that is very stiff, because it has inherited the construction of road tires, etc., etc., it won't be able to deform as much, and therefore all that vibration will be transmitted to the bike and to us. With this type of casing, where the construction is specifically designed to adapt the tire to the terrain from the very beginning, so that it, let's say, conforms to every little imperfection, so that the cyclist, the biker, has more grip. What happens here is that when applied to gravel, we have more deformation and therefore more absorption of those irregularities by the tire. So, well, maybe at some point the brands will step up and make gravel tires more deformable, but for now that's how it is, and that's where we get the advantage of the mountain bike tire. Okay, and on the other hand, there's something you can't see, but with tires, let's take the example of 45 millimeters with a 25 millimeter internal width. The tire sidewall is very short, okay? And it's also very stiff. However, on a 2.25 mounted on a 32 millimeter internal width, the sidewall inside the rim, the part of the tire that sits inside the rim, is taller, which means we'll always have more capacity to absorb vibrations there and less chance of burping. And in general, it gives a much more consistent feel, as if the rim and the tire were a single piece. Try lowering the pressure a lot on gravel tires and you'll notice that it's relatively easy when you lean the bike and put pressure at high speeds for the tire to burp or at the very least feel tense.
Seguridad.
I think you're really going to like this pros and cons section, and we'll be able to discuss a lot of interesting details. We're going to divide it into categories so we can explain everything clearly. Let's start with climbs, the downsides we'll run into on climbs. Steeper slopes make things worse. Why? Well, because in the end we have more rotational mass on the outside of the wheel. In a situation where there's a lot of slope, we can't build momentum because the bike is constantly, well, at low speed. And we find ourselves in a situation where it's literally harder to get the bike uphill than when you have a narrower tire and a narrower rim. If we add to this that the cleaner the climb is, the more of a disadvantage you'll be at compared to other competitors who have a narrower gravel tire. Now, if we analyze the advantages, you'll see that this isn't a matter of black and white, but rather a lot of gray areas start to appear. And in most cases, those gray areas end up benefiting the MTB tire, like this next point. And the big advantage I find with the MTB tire on climbs is that it gives you an impressive level of traction on the rear wheel. Anyone who has done gravel knows that when you face a 12, 15 or even 20% climb on gravel, if the ground is even a little bit loose, I mean if it's not asphalt, you can't lift your butt off the saddle because the rear wheel slips. Many times, depending on the condition of the terrain, even with your butt glued to the saddle, the rear wheel still slips. Okay? What happens is that when we put on these kinds of monsters, that traction increases and usually you can get up off the saddle, or even if you're sitting, you're going to have a lot more traction than your regular tires. Okay, and this, okay? The steeper the slope, the higher the percentage of incline, the worse it is for you, but it doesn't matter if it's a 15, 20 or 25% incline. If the ground is very loose, those with gravel tires will have a much harder time climbing than you, since you have this MTB tire. If we're talking about downhills, honestly, I can't think of any downside to running an MTB tire on descents. However, on climbs to begin with, you have much more controlled braking than with a gravel tire and a narrow rim. All of you who have done gravel and have gone down a trail at high speed, as soon as you touch the brake, the bike, You just can't stop the bike in a very short distance. Act whenever and make any move you want, just like on an MTB. But literally, you're basically hoping nothing unexpected shows up. A dog, a sheep, a route you didn't see, or something like that. Because if you hit it, going downhill with the ground just a bit sandy and all, if you use the rear brake, the bike starts to fishtail. And it's hard to control unless, say, you need a lot of space to anticipate things. With this type of tire, all of that is reduced, and it gets to a point where you're practically riding a rigid MTB in terms of braking, control, and handling. And those are two things that, combined with maybe a third one, almost like a placebo effect, the feeling that since I'm using a wider tire, I can go through anywhere, even if it's technical. Now that it's becoming trendy to include some technical sections in gravel races, well, hey, that also matters. A lot of people who stopped to ask me why I was using such wide tires on my gravel bike thought it was because of the descents. But honestly, the real benefit in competition when it comes to performance, trying to gain positions and finishing as far ahead as possible, is on the flat sections. There's a very important downside, and that's that accelerations don't work in your favor. If you use this type of tire, this type of wheel, because once again you have more rotating mass, it's harder to accelerate the bike, so whenever there are accelerations from 0 to 30 km/h, the fewer there are, the better. But that's not usually a common situation in gravel races. That's something we might find more in Olympic cross country, things like that, right? But once you're up to speed on the flat, really, the more uneven the terrain is, the rougher the ground. The more tractor ruts there are in the middle of the tracks, the more little stones, or even sometimes the more the trail starts to feel technical. Even if it's not quite a real one, the better it is for you. Because I go back to all the technical arguments I gave you before about the tire's ability to conform, higher pressure or rather same pressure, but more air volume, and so on, etc. Really, when you get the feeling that, look, I'll give you an example. All my life I've been better at climbing than on flat terrain, alright? And always, no matter the discipline, when the climb came it was like, okay, now it's my moment, now is when I have to shine, now is when I have to gain an advantage, get ahead of these people I'm with in the group, you know? Well, ever since I've been using these tires, whenever I hit that kind of stretch, doing 35, 37, 40 kilometers an hour, and it's a little uneven, I think, now it's my moment. Because you really notice that the others are pushing a few more watts than you, and even if it's not something that makes a difference right away, it is something that wears them out more over time, little by little, and as the kilometers add up, you feel fresher, and so to speak, you don't really know why. On the other hand, everything that works against you when it comes to acceleration, once you have the bike going at 30 or 35 kilometers per hour, works in your favor. It carries momentum much better without needing to use as many watts. Because as we said before, the rotating mass makes it easier to maintain that momentum. And on the other hand, there's a matter of perception, and I can't give you any data here, but honestly, on pure asphalt, I don't feel like it holds me back that much. Obviously, it holds me back more than a narrower tire, but I don't feel like it holds me back that much more than a 45mm tire with a generous tread like the ones I have back here, which I used in Santa Valley, just to give an example. And now we have the last category, which isn't related to climbs, descents or flats, but rather broader points that I think are important to mention. To start with, I don't recommend this type of setup, especially with a 2.25 as wide as the one I'm using on rainy or wet days. Regardless of the possibility that you might clog the bike with mud, imagine we have a bike where that's not a problem, with a huge tire clearance and you can fit a 2.25 and go into the mud. But you know what happens? In the end, it just weighs you down too much. I've noticed it on days when the ground is just damp. It doesn't have to be muddy, just damp. The tire creates that Velcro effect and really slows you down a lot. I'm not inventing anything new here, because if you look, for example, at motocross races or car rallies, when the ground is damp, they usually use narrower tires. In fact, take a look at cyclocross, where they use, I think, a maximum width of 33mm. no matter how wet it is. They usually use narrower tires when it's wet than when it's dry, so I really don't recommend it at all on rainy days, even if your bike can fit it. Then there's another issue that I think is very important, and it led me to the conclusion that I had to change both the size of the chainring and the length of the cranks. Okay, why? Well, because I told you that one of the downsides is that you need a lot. I mean, you need more strength to turn the wheel when accelerating from 0 to whatever speed, or when going uphill, which in a way is like a constant acceleration because the bike is being slowed down by gravity, right? So I had to switch from the 170mm cranks that I almost always use to 165mm ones, which aside from feeling better biomechanically overall, they also make acceleration easier, okay? And on the other hand, especially the chainring. I've always raced gravel when I've used a single chainring. For example, at Rancho, I raced with a 48 tooth chainring, at Tracker with a 46 tooth one, and with a 46 tooth one last year, and also with the big 48 tooth chainring. This time I used a 44, and with those two sizes, I mean with the adjustment of running a chainring 1 or 2 teeth smaller, a smaller chainring and cranks that are 5mm shorter have made the bike accelerate better. And it's something I was practically forced to change, because with the previous setup it would have been too hard to move the bike in those starts, in those accelerations, in those climbs. Okay, keep that in mind. And there's a third point, which is that such a wide tire I feel ruins the bike's aerodynamics. For example, this Kayas has excellent aerodynamics, but of course putting such a huge tire on, for example on the rear, where the tire sticks out past both sides of the seat tube, what it should do is be hidden right behind the seat tube, so it doesn't create turbulence as the air passes through there. Well, this is something you can notice, right? Because just like I don't feel any extra drag on the flat, actually quite the opposite. In some situations I've tried, for example, a test on an asphalt road, a 10% downhill, and letting the bike go, there comes a moment when the bike just doesn't pick up any more speed. It can't go down any faster because it feels like it's being slowed down by all that disrupted airflow caused by the front tire, but also the rear one, right? What I'm telling you is hard to explain, but being used to testing with road bikes and so on, you take a road bike with a 25, 28 or even 30 tire with a frame that's been designed for that tire width, and you see how it feels. How the whole bike drops as one, because where the airflow first hits the wheel, the tire, it continues along the rim, goes through the fork, and let's say it moves smoothly through the air. With this, it even makes a sound. In short, it disrupts the bike's aerodynamics. It improves your side aerodynamics because you create more surface between the rim and the tire, but it destroys your frontal aerodynamics. It really destroys it. Well, on the plus side, there's this placebo effect I mentioned before about feeling safer. I mean, if that guy in front went through with a 45mm or 40mm, I can go through there with this for sure. And well, it gives you more confidence. And on the other hand, something very important, at least on paper, there's less chance of getting flat, precisely because of that extra deformation capability of the tire. You know that when something gets onto the tire, like a nail, glass, whatever, the stiffer the tire is, the more it's gonna hit that object, that nail, and the easier it will be for it to penetrate. And yet, if the tire deforms, it's more likely to grab it, carry it through the traction area when the tire touches the ground, and then spit it back out. That's one of the reasons why when it rains on the road, when it rains, or rather when the road is wet, you get more flat tires on the road, because the objects on the road stick to the tire and keep spinning with the tire for several rotations until eventually you get a flat, right? So there's less chance of getting a flat. I have to say that over the nearly 1,000 kilometers I've ridden in all kinds of conditions, I haven't gotten a flat. In fact, if I had gotten a flat on the rear wheel, for example, there wouldn't have been, if I got a flat on the sidewall of the rear wheel, there wouldn't have been enough space to insert a plug. So I barely made it out of that one, but I did make it. In a race like Tracker, with a lot of different types of terrain, where you can run into all kinds of situations and where you need a bike that's as versatile as possible, knowing that you'll never have a bike that excels in every aspect. For me, this setup has given me the fastest bike possible on most of the sections, especially in those flat areas that are very common along the tracker route, right? I'll give you two examples. One has to do with that last fast, bumpy track that was right before the final climb, where we were going really fast, 35, 37, 40 kilometers per hour. In this area, I was behind the group because I wanted to save energy to launch my attack on that final climb, which was going to be really steep and loose. And it worked out really well for me. In fact, I managed to get onto the climb first. It was a single track, so nobody could pass me. And out of the group of 8, I think by the time we finished the climb, there were only 2 of us left. So that move worked out well for me there. But basically, what I want is for you to see those images of how on that really bumpy track, which you can't really appreciate in the footage, but it's not really broken. But yes, as I said, it's very bumpy from the tracks left by trucks and tractors. The effect of the mountain tire is practically like being on a flying carpet, or as if I had air cushioned shoes on, like Air Jordan sneakers on my bike, you know? I mean, like I said, it's those kinds of situations where you clearly feel you have a technical advantage over the other riders. And then another example is on a trail on a very specific Strava segment. Those of you from the area know it very well. It's over 3 kilometers long, so it's very good for testing because it's long enough. The conditions of the surface are usually very similar throughout the year because it's inside a forest, it's a single track, and also being inside the forest, it's usually not affected by the wind. And this is a single track that isn't technical at all. It's fast and smooth, but it's included in every race held around here. In all the social rides where everyone goes all out, I mean, I have 300,000 there. Time records from always going full speed through that trail in all kinds of races. And besides, it's a place I always like to go. First, to avoid problems because I know it very well. I know I can go really fast. And staying behind could make someone swerve, make a mistake, whatever, and block me, okay? So it's a place where I always try to go first. The trail, and like I said, it's a place where I've always had good times because you always go through there and go really fast. This time with these tires, many people would say, why use such wide tires? You won't go fast on flat roads, they'll slow you down. But I still set a PR. PR compared to many other tire setups like 50 slick 47 with knobs, 45 slick, 45 with knobs, other gravel tires. The fastest I've ever gone through there was when I was leading the group with this bike setup. And I'm telling you, I've gone through there many other times. In fact, at Santaval, I went through there too, and the time wasn't as good. You're always going full gas. You might think it's just one segment, just on Strava. The whole crazy day is full of PRs I set on this kind of segment, flat ones, where speed is key and supposedly a wide tire shouldn't be an advantage. Anyway, I don't have to convince anyone. I did the experiment because I wanted to. Nobody asked me to sell more MTB tires now. In fact, the tire brands which were this type of tire, this one, I don't know how long this one has been on the market specifically, but I'm sure it's been around for years from when 225s were used in MTB and it was designed for that. And it's simply a coincidence that it's working so well now in gravel. And in no case do I have brands pressuring me to say, now you have to make MTB tires trendy. No, this was something I saw as a trend in the United States. I wanted to try it. And even though it may seem contradictory, I'll say it again. This tire is much faster than a gravel tire, so if you can fit it on your gravel bike, I recommend it because it's going to work really well for you. Anyway, try it, test it, but above all, keep in mind that it's not just about the tire. You have to choose the tire very carefully, but you also have to choose the rim, the hub, the wheel, the combination very carefully. And you have to consider some changes, like for example, the chainring and the cranks. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments. I'm really interested in hearing your opinion, and I'll see you in upcoming videos. Be happy. Bye bye.